Most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid debt. Crypto Kyle looks confused. Because debt is bad, right? Lease Larry smiles. If debt is always bad, how do businesses grow? How do people buy rental properties? How do millionaires borrow against their investments? Crypto Kyle pauses. Wait, so debt isn't the problem? Boomer Bill takes a sip of his coffee. No. Borrowing money doesn't make you poor. Borrowing money without understanding it does. The truth is, debt is one of the most powerful financial tools in the world. Used one way, it quietly builds wealth. Used another, it quietly destroys it. And the difference isn't what you borrowed money for, it's something far simpler. Today, we're going to uncover that difference. Let's do the real math. Lease Larry and Crypto Kyle each borrowed $10,000. Larry gets a loan with a 5% interest rate. Kyle agrees to one charging 25%. Lease Larry grins from ear to ear. 5%? I'll take that all day. Crypto Kyle shrugs with a confident smile. 25%? Relax. I'll make way more than that. 1 year later, Larry has paid $500 in interest. Kyle has paid $2,500. Same amount borrowed, completely different cost. Crypto Kyle's smile disappears. He scratches his head, looking genuinely confused. Wait a second. I paid 5 times more? Now let me ask you something. Who made the better financial decision? Boomer Bill calmly takes a sip of his coffee. Wrong question. Exactly, because I still haven't told you what either of them borrowed the money for. Maybe Larry used his cheap loan to buy a luxury car. Maybe Kyle used his expensive loan to pay for emergency surgery. Or maybe it was the exact opposite. Here's the point. The loan doesn't know what you bought. Boomer Bill takes another calm sip of his coffee. The bank certainly doesn't care. It only cares that you pay it back. Yet for years, we've been taught to think about debt like this. Good debt. Bad debt. Nice. Simple. Easy to remember. Boomer Bill smiles and takes one last sip of his coffee. But real life isn't that simple. Those labels tell you what someone borrowed money for. They don't tell you whether that debt is actually helping them build wealth or quietly making them poorer. So maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of asking, what did they buy? Maybe we should be asking something else. And that question changes everything. The question is this: what does the debt cost you? And what does it give you in return? That's it. Because debt is an exchange. You get money today, and in return, you promise to give back more money tomorrow. Crypto Kyle looks confused. So, lower interest is always better? Not necessarily. Lease Larry smiles proudly. I knew 5% was good debt. Boomer Bill takes a slow sip of his coffee. You're both still looking at only half the equation. Exactly. The interest rate tells you what the debt costs, but it doesn't tell you what the borrowed money does next. Let's go back to Larry. He borrowed $10,000 at 5%. After 1 year, the interest cost is $500. But suppose he used that money to buy something that loses $3,000 in value. Now the cheap loan doesn't look so cheap. He paid $500 in interest and lost another $3,000 on the thing he bought. That's $3,500 gone. Lease Larry's smile slowly disappears. Okay, you didn't have to add it up like that. Now look at Kyle. He borrowed the same $10,000 at 25%. His interest cost is $2,500. Painful. But suppose that borrowed money helps him create $5,000 in additional income. He pays $2,500 for the debt, but the money creates $5,000. After covering the interest, he's still $2,500 ahead. Crypto Kyle suddenly smiles again. Wait, so I won? Not so fast. Boomer Bill takes another sip of his coffee. One good year can make a bad risk look smart. Exactly. Kyle's result was better, but that doesn't automatically mean his decision was better. Because returns are uncertain. Interest payments are not. The bank wants its money whether your investment works or fails. And that's the part people forget. A 5% loan can destroy wealth if the money it buys keeps losing value. A 25% loan can create value if the money produces more than it costs. But the higher the cost of the debt, the less room you have to be wrong. That's why the real question isn't, is this good debt or bad debt? It's, what does this debt cost me? What can this money realistically produce? And what happens if I'm wrong? Because once you understand those three numbers, you start seeing debt the way wealthy people do. And that's where things get interesting. But there's a problem. Even when all three answers look good, debt can still destroy you. Least Larry looks confused. Wait, I thought we just did the math. We did. But there's one thing the math didn't show us. Timing. Suppose Larry takes on debt with an $800 monthly payment. He uses the money to buy something that produces income. In the first month, it makes $1,200. Least Larry smiles. So far, so good. In the second month, it makes another $1,000. Larry leans back confidently. I told you the numbers work. Then month 3 arrives. The income drops to just $300, but the debt payment is still $800. Larry's smile disappears. Wait, I'm $500 short. Exactly. Now look at the full 3 months. The thing produced $2,500. The debt payments totaled $2,400. On paper, Larry made $100. Crypto Kyle looks confused. Hold on. How can he make money and still be in trouble? Because the bank doesn't get paid in averages. It gets paid on schedule. And that changes everything. Larry had enough income over 3 months. He just didn't have enough money when the payment was due. That is the difference between profit and cash flow. A business can be profitable and still run out of cash. A property can make money over a year and still have months where the expenses are higher than the rent. The numbers can be right, and the timing can still kill you. Crypto Kyle looks worried. So even profitable debt can bankrupt you? Absolutely, because debt payments are predictable. Income usually isn't. The bank knows exactly when it wants its money. Life doesn't happen on schedule. And this is where wealthy people think differently. They don't just ask, will this make money? They ask, can I survive long enough for it to make money? Because the best investment in the world means nothing if one bad month forces you out of the game. That's why cash reserves matter. That's why breathing room matters. And that's why people who build wealth with debt rarely borrow the absolute maximum they can afford. They leave room for things to go wrong. Because with debt, survival is part of the strategy. But survival is only half the story. Because if you can survive, debt can do something powerful. It can make a good result bigger. Crypto Kyle smiles. Finally, now we're talking. Least Larry leans forward. I knew debt was good. No, we are definitely not doing this again. Suppose you have $20,000, you could use that money to buy a $20,000 asset with no debt. If the asset rises by 10%, it gains $2,000 in value. Your $20,000 becomes $22,000, a 10% return. Simple. Now let's change one thing. You still have the same $20,000, but this time, you use it as the down payment on a $100,000 asset. The other $80,000 comes from debt. Now suppose the asset rises by the same 10%. It goes from $100,000 to $110,000. The asset gained $10,000, but you only started with $20,000 of your own money. So before interest and other costs, your $20,000 of equity gained $10,000. That's a 50% return on your money. Crypto Kyle's eyes widen. Wait, 10% became 50%? On your $20,000, yes. Least Larry suddenly smiles. So I should borrow as much as possible. Absolutely not. Because leverage does not only make gains bigger, well, it makes losses bigger too. Same $100,000 asset, same $20,000 of your money, same $80,000 of debt. But this time, the asset falls by 10%. Now it is worth $90,000. The asset lost $10,000, but remember, you only started with $20,000 of your own money. So that $10,000 loss wiped out half of your equity. Crypto Kyle stopped smiling. Oh, exactly. A 10% gain on the asset created a 50% gain on your money. A 10% loss on the asset created a 50% loss on your money. Same debt, same leverage. Completely different result. That is what people misunderstand. Debt is not a wealth machine. It does not know whether you made a smart decision. It does not know whether the market is going up or down. It does not know whether you are ready or just overconfident. Debt simply takes whatever happens next and makes the consequences bigger. That is leverage. Crypto Kyle looks thoughtful. So debt doesn't create the result? Exactly, it amplifies it. A good decision can become more profitable. A bad decision can become more painful. And one mistake can become very expensive. That is why wealthy people do not use debt just because they can borrow. They use it when the potential reward justifies the risk, when the payments are survivable, and when one bad outcome will not wipe them out. Because the goal is not to borrow the most money. The goal is to use debt without letting debt control you. Debt can accelerate wealth, but acceleration works in both directions. And if you don't understand that, leverage doesn't make you wealthy. It just makes you wrong faster. So how do you know when debt is actually worth taking? You run it through a test, not the bank's test. Yours. Because the bank asks one question. Can you make the payments? You need to ask something much harder. Does this debt make my life stronger or more fragile? Start with the first question. What does the debt actually cost? Not just the interest rate, the fees, the monthly payment, the total interest, and the time you are committing to it. A small payment can hide a very expensive decision. Least Larry looks uncomfortable. Why do I feel like that was about me? Because it was. Now the second question. What will the borrowed money realistically produce? Not what you hope it will produce. Not what happened in the best year. Not what someone online promised you. What can it realistically produce? If the return only works when everything goes perfectly, the math does not work. Crypto Kyle slowly lowers his phone. I feel like that one was about me. It was. Third question. Can you survive the bad version of the story? What if the income drops? What if the asset loses value? What if the project takes twice as long? What if life happens at the worst possible time? If one bad month can destroy the entire plan, you are not using debt. Debt is using you. And finally, what happens if you are completely wrong? Not slightly wrong, completely wrong. Can you recover? Or does one mistake wipe out years of progress? Because wealthy people do not avoid every risk. They avoid risks they cannot survive. Boomer Bill takes a slow sip of his coffee. Then he looks at Larry and Kyle. The goal isn't to never fall. It's to never bet so much that you can't get back up. For once, nobody argues with him, because that is the real difference. People who misunderstand debt ask, how much can I borrow? People who understand debt ask, how much risk can I survive? Debt is not automatically good. It is not automatically bad. It is a contract, a cost, a risk, and sometimes a tool. Used without understanding, it can steal years from your life. Used with discipline, it can help you control assets larger than the cash you started with. But it never removes risk. It only changes who carries it and how much. So before you sign your name to any debt, do the real math. Ask what it costs. Ask what it can realistically produce. Ask whether you can survive the bad months. And ask what happens if you are wrong. Because if you understand those four things, you understand something most people never do. Debt is not about borrowing money. It is about buying time, taking risk, and deciding whether the possible reward is worth both. And if you can understand that, you don't just understand debt. You understand a huge part of how wealth is built. Crypto Kyle looks at lease Larry. So, no more 25% loans? Larry smiles. Let's not get carried away. Boomer Bill takes one last sip of his coffee. Some people never learn. If you want more simple finance, real math, and no hype, subscribe. We're just getting started.